Hey there, everybody. Today we get into our first lesson from Unit 3, and the title of the lesson is Foundations of Contemporary Economic Globalization. All right, so in your notes, you'll see that you have a big oval. In that oval, you can write this down. You can write factors that have contributed to contemporary economic globalization. So we're talking about the third round of globalization today, and we're talking about the different things that served as foundations for that third round of globalization. So you can draw this arrow and you can make a new oval and you can write about the foundations, which basically means the starting points or the building blocks of today's economically globalized world. So you guys made a timeline in the last unit, and you learned about a couple of world wars, right? So we learned about how imperialism was one of the main causes of these world wars, right? As empires competed with each other to get as many colonies as they could, they came into conflict with each other. And as these empires desired more and more land, they were running out of land to colonize, and they ended up fighting with each other, and this turned into a really big bloody war that we call World War One. And then there was a brief period of time between World War One and World War Two, and by the end of World War Two, nations were interested in finding new ways of structuring the global economy. Okay, so by the end of World War Two, the Allies, which means these are the countries that were on the same side of the war as Canada, right? So countries like Britain, countries like France, countries like the United States. These were countries that were at the end of World War II. They were on our team, so to speak. Okay, they were concerned about how they were going to rebuild their economies, right? Because economies were very, very much devastated by the world wars. Right, so you look at this picture here, this picture here. This is what much of Europe looked like at the end of World War II. Right, so at the end of World War II, there was a lot of destruction. Cities were destroyed, farmland was destroyed, millions and millions of people had lost their lives, and so there was a lot of talk of, okay, how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? How can we prevent a World War III? And how can we rebuild our economies to make them better? So the first thing I want you guys to write down is the United Nations, right? So the UN was created to encourage conversation and cooperation between countries so they can avoid war, right? The goal here is to get nations to talk to each other instead of just fighting with each other, right? So if they talk to each other, maybe they can resolve their differences in a peaceful way. The United Nations had a really important meeting in the United States, and it was called the Bretton Woods Conference, and they came up with an agreement that was called the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. So there were 44 countries that signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, and they established rules and organizations to encourage international trade. Right, the goal here was to achieve long-lasting peace, and they figured a good way to achieve long-lasting peace was to encourage countries to trade with each other. Because if you trade with each other, well, you don't want to go to war with your business partners, right? You don't want your allies or your trading partners to be attacked in a war. So if countries do business with each other, they might not fight with each other. That was the idea. All right, so there's a Bretton Woods video which you can watch. It's in this playlist. You can check that out. Okay. The United Nations also created something called the World Bank. Right, so this was established to help rebuild the countries destroyed by World War II, and it provided billions of dollars in aid, which means support or help to Western Europe, as Western Europe was destroyed by World War II. Okay, the World Bank still exists today, and it continues to provide loans to member countries. So countries that are members of the World Bank, they can take out loans from the World Bank if they are in financial difficulty, which means if they need help when it comes to money. So, for example, if a country has already borrowed money from another country and they are in debt towards that other country, well, then they can take out a loan from the World Bank to help them pay off their debt to the country that they had borrowed money from before. We'll talk more about the World Bank in a bit. So, however, the countries, they have to meet certain conditions, right? There are certain things that a country has to do before it can take out a loan from the World Bank. Okay, so in order to qualify for a loan from the World Bank, your country must meet the following conditions. Your country must have a democratic government, right? A government where the people are allowed to choose their government by voting. And the government must prove that it has a low level of corruption, right? That there's no corruption going on. Okay, and importantly, they must also have a capitalist free market economy, right? So an economy based on the principles of Adam Smith. Okay, the next one is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. So the IMF was created alongside the World Bank. They were meant to work together, and their goal is also to provide loans to countries in need, but also it's to stabilize currency exchanges. We'll talk about that. Okay, so you have the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. It is in charge of keeping currency exchange rates stable and giving short-term financial help to countries in need. So let's take a look at the word currency, right? Canada's currency is the Canadian dollar. The currency in the United States is the American dollar. The currency in Mexico is the peso, right? So different countries have different currencies. It's their type of money that they have, okay? And if you want to get your Canadian money turned into money from another country, right? If you want your Canadian currency turned into the currency of a different country, well, then there's going to be an exchange rate, right? So I don't know what the exchange rate is today, but usually if let's say you have one Canadian dollar and you want to turn it into an American dollar, well, you might end up with 85 cents, something like that, right? Because of the exchange rate. And the IMF wants exchange rates to be stable. The IMF does not want exchange rates to change very much from day to day because the IMF wants a lot of world trade. They want a lot of international business. And so if exchange rates are stable, well, then it's easier for international businesses to operate because they can have uh, predictability, right? They know what the future is going to look like. Okay, so in your notes, you'll see that there's a spot where you can calculate how much one Canadian dollar is worth in the currencies of the following countries. So you can just use Google, look that up, and then you can put your answers in your notes. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the IMF. Money for the IMF is provided by member countries, and each country pays an amount into a pot, right? So there's one big pot. Every member country puts money into that pot based on the size of their economy. Okay. Now there are some concerns regarding the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank and the IMF, they charge interest on their loans and expect them to be paid back, right? So they are not charities. So if your country borrows, $100 million from the World Bank, well, your country has to pay that money back. And on top of that, they have to pay an extra percentage called interest. And then that allows the countries who lent the money in the first place to gain a profit. So in order to qualify for loans, countries must adopt free market policies, right? They have to become capitalist countries, and not every country necessarily wants to do that. And many critics will say that they are controlled by the USA and other developed countries, which can use their influence to block votes to make changes. So, for example, many rules or many votes require 85% of countries or 85% of the global economy to support that motion. But the United States, they represent 16.4% of the global economy. So that means their vote is worth 16.4%. So if all countries of the world, they all vote yes on something, but the United States votes no, well, then the no side wins because their country is big enough, their economy is big enough to make it so that all other countries of the world put together cannot reach that 85%, right? So some critics of the IMF and the World Bank will say that, well, the United States has too much control over the institution. Okay, and then there's another video here that you can check out that takes a look at the differences between the World Bank and the IMF to help you understand how they are different. Okay, and then there is a little bit of reading here that we are doing in class. And that's about it for today. Okay, have a good day.